Hello there, John Coturillo here, the counsellor of your listener. Thank you for joining me for this episode. As per usual, thank you to everyone who makes it possible for me to live my vision every day, be you a client who allows me the privilege of entering into your life to help you with your goals, or as a listener or supporter of the podcast, thank you to everyone. In today's episode, I'm going to be discussing the broad concept of conspiracy theories and how we treat people with beliefs that we deem irrational. Now, as per usual, what you find on the internet is not advice. If you have any concerns about yourself or someone else, please seek professional help. Also, today's episode is not going to involve any analysis of whether particular conspiracy theories are true or not. Those are much larger issues that are beyond the scope of one practical episode. This is an analysis of the culture on how we tend to treat people with beliefs that we don't understand or that we find to be irrational, and how we sometimes understand those beliefs and perhaps some of the double standards or the hypocrisies that we exhibit in the way that we think about certain beliefs. Most of us most likely know of some conspiracy theories or have an understanding of what they are. A conspiracy theory is essentially a supposition that events that happen in the world or have happened in the world took place for nefarious purposes in reality, but are presented in popular culture or popular belief as being either due to causes other than what they really are, or being innocuous or even helpful. Now, one of the most common bases for the criticism of conspiracy theories is that they're not based on the proper standard of objective evidence that we would need in order to make the types of claims that they are making in a valid sense. It is possible for conspiracy theories to be based on lies. People can spread misinformation for their own purposes, or they can spread them through ignorance. Beyond that, what often happens is people base their suppositions on anecdotal or coincidental evidence. That is to say, they note that certain events have taken place in their own life or in someone else's life, or they've heard stories from other people who have had certain events take place in their own life, or they observe that two events coincidentally happen to occur alongside each other in a particular context. And from that limited base of evidence, they draw a dysfunctional conclusion about what the cause may be. This is a fallacious type of cause and effect argument. It argues that just because two events have taken place, that one necessarily causes the other, or that they are related to each other and must have been born of a common cause. The problem with this type of thinking, as I have discussed in the past, is that it is incredibly heuristic, which means it involves taking mental shortcuts. Now, as I've discussed extensively, the human mind has evolved to make quick decisions about what to think about the world and how to act in relation to it. The reason being that in our distant past, if we couldn't make quick decisions, and even today if we can't make quick decisions, then we would spend so much time thinking and considering that we wouldn't be able to actually act in the world. We wouldn't live our daily lives. And so our minds are often predisposed to using whatever information is most salient to decide what to think, to draw conclusions. And because emotions potentially have an evolutionary purpose, they're designed to warn us of specific events or draw our attention to specific events so that we can act on them or in response to them. Often the information that is most infused with emotion is the information that we take to be true, because when we focus on it, we cease to consider other information, other possible explanation for what has happened. And in addition to that, fear is a powerful motivator, and a lot of us have a sense of fear about what happens in the world, which again has an evolutionary basis. If we don't fear anything, then we don't consider what may be threatening. If we don't consider what may be threatening, then we essentially allow those threats to affect us without taking any action to prevent them. And so because of this type of predisposition to heuristics, we're constantly seeking simple explanations for what happens in the world. We constantly want to feel correct and feel like we know something, because that knowledge is power, and feeling like we have knowledge gives us a sense of security in that I know what the truth is, therefore I won't be brainwashed by people who want to hijack my consciousness for their own purposes. And to a large extent, the world is a dangerous place in which people do create events for their own gain. People do exploit others. People do harm others for their own purposes. There's no denying that, and there's no escaping it, no matter how much we try to avoid it. But the problem with conspiracy theory type thinking is that it ignores that the mind is inherently a biased machine that does process information in a way that tends to only perceive one aspect of a problem, while also ignoring other aspects that could provide equally plausible and sometimes more plausible explanations about why something happens. It ignores that coincidences can take place. And often if you present this argument, someone who believes in these type of theories might say, well, sure, technically anything can be a coincidence, but Don't you think it's too much of a coincidence for these types of events to happen alongside each other? Well, what's influencing you to conclude that something is too much of a coincidence? How do you measure the threshold at which something ceases to be a coincidence and becomes an actual cause and effect relationship? It's qualitative, and at the same time, it's a fact that our mind processes information in a biased fashion. How do you know that you're correct? Now, this is not to condemn all conspiracy theorists and say that they're horrible people, or even to say, again, that their theories are necessarily wrong, because to judge that is far beyond the scope of one discussion. But something which I will often make salient to people is, in life, there are no rules for discerning the truth, only truth itself. You can't prescribe a rule for everything that happens in the world because the world is far too complex. Yes, there is such thing as natural order, there is such thing as regularity in nature, but nature is an incredibly complicated beast. The world is an incredibly complicated place. And so when you choose to believe something, you need to put in efforts to make sure that when you choose to believe that you're only believing it based on the most objective available information, and that believing that is not going to then lead you to a place that becomes destructive for you and for other people. Again, not necessarily saying who is right and wrong here, but there are implications for being a conspiracy theorist. There are social implications. If you are hypersensitive to what happens in the world and attribute all events to nefarious sources, you can become hypersensitive to threats. And while you need to be vigilant, it can also inadvertently lead someone to be incredibly distrustful and resentful towards others, sometimes patronizing people who don't agree with us, and actually separating ourselves from other people because we don't feel we can trust them, or we feel that no one understands us. Now, again, sometimes people, and I'm going to address this in just a minute, but sometimes what can happen is, if we can't find common ground between one another and we only define ourselves by our differences, we cease to be able to interact with people. It also primes us to see everything through a perspective of the world being dangerous and everyone being part of the conspiracy in which we believe. And then that self-perpetuates, in which the mind is so focused on only seeing where the danger is that it doesn't see where the good is in people. And it can get to the point where people cease to engage in any kind of debate or civil discussion, and they feel so stigmatized by other people that they'll stop justifying their beliefs because they don't feel they have to explain themselves, which is technically true. You're not necessarily obliged to explain what you believe, but then that can lead you to stop justifying it to yourself. You can adopt the belief and decide, I'm not going to justify it to myself anymore. I don't need to. I'm just going to keep believing it because I know it's the truth without ever questioning it. And no matter how sure you are of yourself, everyone needs to question themselves regularly. Everyone has to question the truth at some stage. That's part of being a critical thinker. Take it to the extremities, people can become so involved in these theories that it can convince them to become violent against people who don't believe in them, or against people who they believe are the problem. There is also a problem, though, with how we tend to treat people who hold these types of beliefs. People often laugh at conspiracy theorists, so they often treat them inhumanely, treat them as if they're less than. And while you can be nasty and a conspiracy theorist, being a conspiracy theorist does not inherently make you nasty. Often people do have good intentions towards the human race. It's often that people care about the good people of the world that they decide to pursue these paths, because they want other people who they deem to be innocent but vulnerable to become aware of how they're potentially being exploited and where the threats are, so that they can also protect themselves. Often it comes from the right place. And there are plenty of people who are both conspiracy theorists and are trying to help others wake up, so to speak. They're not necessarily shunning people who don't agree with them, but trying to convince them, believe this because you need to know it if you're going to protect yourself against the threats in the world. But let's also consider some of the logic of immediately dismissing conspiracy theories. Yes, there's problems in conspiracy theory logic, but the knee-jerk reactions that people tend to have to it from the opposite side of the argument also can be problematic. People tend to assume that rational, scientific, or objective thinking can't be misused or can't be corrupted. And often when people say, trust the science, otherwise you're a conspiracy theorist, often they don't understand science themselves and they don't understand the limitations of it. I have discussed this in the past, but let's briefly recapitulate. Science is the pursuit of knowledge in a way that eliminates, to the maximum extent possible, cognitive bias. The purpose of science is to collect data analyze it, and then draw conclusions from the resulting information in a way that minimizes the opportunities for our mind to interpret or decide based on distorted thinking or based on our own personal or emotional preferences. That's the purpose of science. The methodologies used in science are designed to take human bias out of observation and conclusion. It's never guaranteed, and it's not possible to entirely eliminate human bias, but the scientific method is designed to minimize it. But the whole point of it is that you have to understand it. What separates a science from a faith or a conventional or traditionalist view is that it is designed to be constantly questioned. It is designed to constantly check whether there is any error in the way that it is perceiving. It's designed to constantly attempt to disprove what it states and only make tentative conclusions that something is true once an attempt to disprove it has failed. If we want to make a scientific conclusion, rather than just collecting the evidence that it's true, we try to find the evidence that it's not true. And then if we test that evidence and find that it doesn't successfully disprove what we're trying to claim, and there is additional evidence to state that what we are claiming is valid, then we can say tentatively this might be true. But then we constantly revise that claim as well. That's when science is practiced properly. But anything can be corrupted and misused. And throughout history, horrible acts have been committed against human beings in the name of science. A lot of people who say trust the science, this is not an insult, okay? If you're one of these people, I'm not saying you're incapable, but only certain people with certain education will understand how science works, which is why I genuinely maintain that this knowledge has to be made public and should be more generalized so that more people understand it, because in the end, everyone deserves to understand this. But a lot of the people who say trust the science, if they were to pick up a scientific paper and try to make sense of how the conclusions are drawn, a lot of them wouldn't understand it. If you can't understand it, how do you know that you're not being lied to? And if you state, well, why would someone spend their entire life studying science just to fool people? Then you're ignoring a very important science, psychology. When you study psychology and history, what you will find is that some of the most intelligent people, some of the people who have worked hardest in their lives have been people who had an unnatural and unhealthy, a pathological desire to exploit others for their own gain because they drew pleasure from it. And they would use any trick they could to make it happen, including claiming that what they said was scientific. People who want to control others extensively and have broad power are prone to serious mental problems, and giving them power is extremely dangerous. If you can hijack anything that is meant to be good in theory and misuse it to hurt people, what makes you think you can't hijack science? There's further hypocrisy here in that there are many conspiracy theorists who actually consider themselves to be fighting for freedom, and people who treat authority as fascism will also call these same conspiracy theorists fascist, because they say they're fighting for freedom, but under the surface, what they really want is more authority. They just want their brand of authority rather than our brand of authority. This is a fallacy because if you objectively analyze any set of beliefs, any common set of beliefs, any ideology, you will find that the cognitive tactics that people use, regardless of politics, regardless of religion, regardless of whatever the basis of the belief is, people use essentially the same cognitive tactics in response to disagreement. Somebody disagrees, they're misguided, they're delusional, they're brainwashed. They've been indoctrinated. They're fascist, they're communist, they're cookers, they're conspiracy theorists. Every ideology essentially has its own brand of conspiracy theorist. Whenever something is a threat to an ideology, regardless of what ideology it is, there will always be people who make fallacious claims about what is causing that threat and why that threat exists and what should happen to people who present that threat. And in almost any case, it is based on perceptions that they've developed based on faulty information, based on faulty processing of information. This is why I say there is no such thing as a correct belief. There's objective reality and truth, and then there are beliefs that we invent to try to convince ourselves that we know the truth because it gives us a feeling of security. When beliefs become too extreme, they can become conspiracy theories, and any ideology can develop this. Something to which I'd also like to draw attention is I've often heard people make jokes about conspiracy theorists being schizophrenic. I'm going to condemn this because that's not a joke. Schizophrenia is a serious mental illness that can be devastating for the people who suffer it and for the people around them. I've worked with a number of people with schizophrenia spectrum disorders. I've known people personally who have schizophrenia spectrum disorders. It's not funny. Many of the people who will use this as an insult would also criticize others for using other types of mental illnesses as derogatory ones. You would receive criticism for using labels about people with intellectual disabilities towards others whom you don't like. You know exactly which labels I mean. Schizophrenia is a serious mental illness, and if you have it, it's not your fault. And yes, it is a common symptom of schizophrenia to have irrational beliefs, or to believe ideas that cannot possibly be true. To deride people that way, it doesn't demonstrate care for society, it doesn't demonstrate a social conscience, it demonstrates bullying. But overall, in conclusion, none of us, and I mean none of us, are as wise as we think, right? We are all subject to making cognitive mistakes. We are all subject to the laws of Mother Nature and how Mother Nature has designed us. But we all have more in common in terms of our needs and what we can do for each other than what we have in contrast. And if we truly want to fight any oppressive force when it exists, if we truly want the best of possible worlds, we have to be willing to accept that we are flawed, that we make mistakes, and that there is always something that we can learn from other people, and that we should engage as much as possible with other people, look out for each other, and also warn each other when we think that other people might be going down a path that might be destructive for them or the people around them. If something ends in destruction, most of the time, it's bad. If something potentially could be destructive, think about whether that is worth the risk before you engage in it. So thank you for joining me for this episode. As per usual, if you have any concerns about yourself or someone else, please never take what you find on the internet as advice. Seek professional help. Also, if you have any ideas about what you'd like me to discuss on the program, or you'd like to be a collaborator or a guest, I'd love to hear from you. Please feel free to contact me. And until next time, take care.